Hi, my name is Vasil, and welcome to the Finformer, where we'll make sure that you're always financially informed. The United States hit its debt ceiling on January 19th of this year, hitting a total accumulated national debt of $31.4 trillion. Yes, let me repeat that for you.
$31.4 trillion.
And since the US hit its debt ceiling, United States Secretary of Treasury Janet Yellen has been going around trying to impose temporary extraordinary measures trying to keep the government afloat. These measures are temporary. That means they cannot last forever. So the government right now is running on fumes and it is living on borrowed time. So let me give you a bit more context on how this whole thing works. The government makes money from taxes. It collects revenue in the form of taxes, and that money is spent on various sectors of discretionary and non-discretionary spending, such as education, welfare, healthcare, and obviously defense, which is one of the biggest spendings for the government. Now, the thing is that although governments collect taxes, these taxes are not always enough to pay for all the various expenditures of the government. In the case when the government is spending more money than it's bringing in, it's called a budget deficit. Budget deficits have to be financed by the government by issuing long term, short term, and mid term debt. They have to take on loans and use that money to pay for that additional spending. Well, then you must be thinking, who's going to stop the government from taking as much loan as they want and spending all that money? Good question. That is where the concept of debt ceiling comes in. The debt ceiling, just like a credit card limit, is a legal restriction on the ability of the government to accumulate debt. The debt ceiling was put in place in 1917 when the World War I was happening, and the US needed that flexibility to be able to meet all its spending needs and also the war effort. So the Congress agreed to put in place a debt ceiling, which was the maximum borrowing they could do. But within that limit, they could borrow and spend. Now, this whole question of raising the debt ceiling, it's not nothing anything new. Like it has happened before. As a matter of fact, the debt ceiling has already been increased 78 times since 1960. So that's on average more than one time per year. And it has only been decreased 5 times in that time frame. So the question is, why does the debt ceiling need to be raised? Okay, that's $1 million question. The answer to that question is, as the economy of the country grows, the spending needs of the government increase as well. And a lot of these times, like I said before, the government doesn't have the revenues to meet those spending needs. So there's a deficit in the budget, and that deficit is financed by borrowing, which adds and accumulates in the debt of the country. Now, as the debt accumulates and that keeps on increasing and increasing and increasing, it will come to a point when it hits the debt ceiling, as it did this year, and that ceiling needs to be raised. So if the debt ceiling has been raised before as well and so many times, why is it particularly an issue this time? Well, it has been an issue for a couple of years now. It happened in 2013. It has been increased since then as well. And every time it was the same fiasco. But this time things just got worse. The problem, particularly this time with the debt ceiling, is that national debt is expected to grow in hard times when the government is spending more money than what is bringing in through tax revenues and it has a deficit. But when good time comes and the economy is booming, on those times, there's an expectation for the government to spend less, have a surplus, and pay off some of that debt. But the problem has been that since 2001, that means since 22 years ago, the US government has not seen a single year of surplus. The government has been in deficit, or rather, the budget has been in deficit, and that national debt has been growing over the past 22 years. So, why has the government been having these deficits since 2001? Well, that's also a fair question. Well, I think, and that this is purely my opinion, the dot com bubble burst in 2001 or around that time, and I think since that time the government has been in damage control mode. So, for example, the dot com bubble burst in 2001, and then you had the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008, and then you had the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. So every 7 to 8 years or 10 years, something happens. Before, the most recent crisis was the 2020 COVID-19 pandemic that dealt a hard blow to the United States economy. And I think that's where things went really, really wrong. The United States government, in an effort to support the economy, which was shut down, people were struggling, they were laid off, there were no jobs, they went on a spending spree. And I'm not saying that it's a spree. I would say some of that was actually needed, because that spending was needed for healthcare, that spending was needed for welfare, but they were also sending out stimulus checks, and a lot of the spending was done with the money that the government didn't actually have. So what did they do? They did what they knew best. They took on more debt. During the pandemic, the United States national debt increased from 22.71 trillion in 2019 to 26.95 trillion in 2020, 28.43 trillion in 2021, and 30.92 trillion in 2022. Now imagine that. All that debt to support all that deficit for the spending that was done during the pandemic to support the economy, the people, the stimulus, the welfare, the healthcare, with money the government simply didn't have. So here's the catch. All that deficit was financed by free money. What I mean by that is Federal Reserve reduced the interest rates to pretty much 0% when the COVID-19 pandemic hit. That's not such a bad thing. They were trying to support the economy. I understand that. But such an influx of liquidity in the economy where the interest rates are pretty much zero and the government has just pulled trillions of dollars out of thin air to support the economy in forms of welfare and stimulus checks, all that money accompanied by the supply chain issues and the bottlenecks that were created by the shutdowns during the COVID-19 pandemic around the world, they just turned into this huge inflation headache for the government. Around 2021, the inflation started to escalate. Initially, Treasury and Federal Reserve and central banks around the world, they kept saying that it was transitory. They were all following the same script, that the inflation would go away by itself, but apparently it didn't. And eventually, the banks decided to go in heavy on the rate increases, which is the only tool at their disposal to deal with inflation. They started increasing interest rates rapidly and drastically. From 0% in 2020, 21, all of a sudden, by the end of 2022 and in beginning of 23, we were looking at interest rates in the range of 4-5%. Now imagine when the government has recently borrowed trillions of dollars, added all that to an already existing pile of national debt, and your interest rates skyrocket to levels not seen in the past decade. The interest payments on that debt increased. Now, a lot of that debt, because, like I said, the government hasn't had a surplus in a long time, it has to be rolled over every year. So that debt is becoming more and more and more expensive with each passing month and each passing year. And as you look at this graph that I'm showing you right now, the interest payments on that debt is increasing and becoming a bigger and bigger portion of the United States budget every year. Now, if we increase the ceiling at this point, it will keep happening because there will be no surplus. So every year that deficit will keep getting added to the existing debt pile. So if you ask me, I see three possible outcomes of the situation. Number one, the Congress agrees to raise the debt ceiling without any budgetary preconditions. What that means is they're just kicking the can down the road. They are letting the current government borrow more, accumulate more debt without asking them to either spend less or get more in revenues. And the additional debt and the additional deficit and the additional interest payments, they keep getting added to the existing debt pile. So we'll be having this conversation once again, maybe in another video, a few years down the line or a few months down the line, when we'll be discussing the same thing. And I will refer back to this video and say, I told you so. Or maybe somewhere in between, the government will wake up and think, oh, we need to fix this. And they'll start doing things like either increasing taxes or cutting on spending, both of which are not good news for you and me. Why? Because higher taxes impact the economy negatively, and cutting spending. Government spending is a big part of the GDP. So if they do start cutting out on that, well, the GDP suffers. The second option is that they increase or raise the debt ceiling, but with conditions, and that is the one they're trying to work on right now. Both sides of the Congress trying to get to an agreement. One is saying, give us that additional debt ceiling without any conditions. The other saying, okay, we can give you the condition, but let's talk about it. We need you to be more fiscally responsible, spend less, earn more, that kind of a thing. Not happening right now. We don't know which way it's going to go, but that seems to be a sensible solution to me, because that at least solves the root problem. The problem with that is, when the government starts spending less, like I said before, the GDP suffers. People lose jobs. People make less money, and that less money is not flowing into the economy. So the economy suffers as a whole, and then you are looking at the possibility of a recession. Now, the third option, and this is the worst one, so I kept it for the last, that is that the Congress does not come to an agreement and the debt ceiling is not raised. What happens in that case is, we're looking at, first of all, the possibility of a default. The United States government will not or might not be able to make good on their debt payments, on the interest payments, on the principal payments. That is really bad, because it has never happened in the history of the United States. So you're looking at a, sh- a shock to the financial system of the whole world. Investors will lose confidence in the United States government. There is a possibility that or not even a possibility, quite likely that the creditworthiness of the United States deteriorates. They lose their credit ratings, and then you're looking at a recession, because the investor will start pulling money out of the United States, right? So the GDP suffers, and the government actually ends up having to cut on expenses because they don't have the money to spend it, and they're not able to borrow more. So they start cutting on spending, and the GDP suffers. There are mass layoffs. Everyone is suffering in that situation. I don't think that is likely to happen, because no one, doesn't matter who's in power, wants to inherit a broken economy. But that is a possibility, although a theoretical one. Another option that is being discussed, thrown out in the air or thrown up in the air, is the possibility of minting $1 trillion coin. I don't know how likely that is, because isn't that where this whole problem started? Pulling money out of thin air, right? And then there's the one where the government can prioritize who they want to pay first and who they want to pay last. Now, that one is questionable. There are legal uh, questions around it, whether the government is actually able to do that or not. Where they can decide, oh, we don't want to pay, or we can't pay the salaries right now for all our employees, but we have to pay the interest and all the other principal payments on our debt, because these people can suffer in that case. But that's all up in the air. I don't know which way it will go, and hopefully they come to the right decision. I will keep making more videos. We'll discuss the topics that we've talked about in this video already, like inflation, interest rates, the banking crisis. So stay tuned and stay informed. But let me tell you what you can do to fix this situation right now. You can like, subscribe my channel, and hit the bell icon so you always stay informed.